Hello out there. This is White Ash Flies with Colin Mahoney. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope you're all doing well out there. Today I'll be reading the Phaeton episode from Book 2 of Ovid's Metamorphoses, Arthur Golding's translation, in which Phaeton asks Apollo, as proof of his paternity, to let him take the chariot of the sun for an ill-advised drive. When the Roman poet Publius Ovidius Naso was banished from Rome in 8 AD, he cast his own manuscript of his unpublished masterpiece, Metamorphoses, into the fire in despair. Fortunately, his friends who also had copies didn't follow suit, and eventually had published this vast compendium of myth and folklore, some 250 stories of transformation, ringing throughout with correspondences between man's nature and the greater world and universe of which he's a part. From its publication in 1565, Arthur Golding's translation served as the Metamorphoses for Elizabethan and Jacobean England. Ovid was Shakespeare's favorite author, and the Metamorphoses echoes throughout his plays, not least in The Tempest, when Shakespeare even has the magician Prospero use Golding's own language in an incantation. Golding's translation has been faulted for using the very long 14er, or 14-syllable line, as its building block, which inevitably required Golding to use filler adjectives and phrases to get his counts up to 14. It is certainly true that Golding's version has many jawbreakers, as when Apollo advises Phaeton in today's reading, "And least perchance thou overmuch the right-hand way should take," which is an awfully long-winded and contorted way of saying, avoid the right-hand side. It's also true that while Ovid's original counts 12,000 lines, Golding's translation runs to some 14,500 lines. But, as with so many poets of his time, word economy and concision apparently weren't priorities for Golding, or he certainly wouldn't have built his life's work out of 14ers. To fault him for slackness is to me like beating up on Bob Cousy because he never shot 3-pointers. I think of Golding as a writer who preferred to stretch his legs, who was inclusive rather than exclusive of language and images. His priority was bringing Ovid to life for his Elizabethan audience, and the result pulses with energy, humanity, and wit. On every page, Golding breaks up his lines in interesting ways, until the burden of the 14er disappears for the reader, temporarily at least. And the variety and color of his language is delightful and surprising throughout. This is among the longer episodes in the Metamorphoses, and gets much of its length from a catalogue of the destruction which Phaeton's foolish ride precipitates. Ovid lists nations, seas, lakes, rivers, mountains, islands, and springs by name, to help the reader grasp the global, even universal extent of this catastrophe, brought about by human pride and greed. You can find this and other episodes of White Ash Flies on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud, Anchor FM, and Acast. And now, the Phaeton episode of Ovid's Metamorphoses on White Ash Flies. There was his match in heart and years, the lusty Phaeton, a stalworth stripling, strong and stout, the golden Phoebus' son, whom, making proud and stately vaunts of his so noble race, and unto him in that respect in nothing giving place, the son of Io could not bear, but said unto him thus, "No marvel though thou be so proud and full of words of us, for every fond and trifling tale the which thy mother makes, thy giddy wit and hair-brained head forthwith for gospel takes. Well, vaunt thyself of Phoebus still, for when the truth is seen, thou shalt perceive that father's name a forged thing to bean." At this reproach did Phaeton wax as red as any fire, Howbeit for the present time did shame repress his ire. Unto his mother Climene straight he goeth to detect the spiteful words that Epaphus against him did object. Yes, mother, quoth he, and which ought your greater grief to be? I, who at other times of talk was wont to be so free and stout, had ne'er a word to say. I was ashamed to take so foul a foil, the more because I could none answer make. But if I be of heavenly race exacted, as ye say, then show some token of that high and noble birth, I pray, and vouch me for to be of heaven. With that he gently cast his arms about his mother's neck, and clasping her full fast, besought her as she loved his life, and as she loved the life of Merops, and had kept herself as undefiled wife, and as she wished wealthily his sisters to bestow, she would some token give whereby his rightful sire to know. It is a doubtful matter whether Climene moved more with this her Phaeton's earnest suit, exacting it so sore, or with the slander of the bruit laid to her charge before, did hold up both her hands to heaven, and looking on the sun, My right dear child, I safely swear, quoth she to Phaeton, that of this star the which so bright doth glister in thine eye, of this same sun that cheers the world with light indifferently, wert thou begot. And if I feign, then with my heart I pray that never may I see him more unto my dying day. But if thou have so great desire thy father for to know, thou shalt not need in that behalf much labour to bestow. The place from whence he doth arise adjoineth to our land, and if thou think thy heart will serve, then go and understand the truth of him. When Phaeton heard his mother saying so, he gan to leap and skip for joy. He fed his fancy, though, upon the heaven and heavenly things. And so with willing mind, from Ethiop first his native home, and afterward through Ind, set underneath the morning star, he went so long, till as he found me where his father's house in daily rising was. The princely palace of the sun stood gorgeous to behold, on stately pillars builded high of yellow burnished gold, beset with sparkling carbuncles that like to fire did shine. The roof was framed curiously of ivory pure and fine, the two door leaves of silver clear a radiant light did cast. But yet the cunning workmanship of things therein far passed the stuff whereof the doors were made. For there a perfect plat had Vulcan drawn of all the world, both of the surges that embrace the earth with winding waves, and of the steadfast ground, and of the heaven itself also that both encloseth round. And first and foremost in the sea the gods thereof did stand, loud-sounding Triton with his shirl and writhen trump in hand, unstable Proteo changing aye his figure and his hue, from shape to shape a thousand scythes as list him to renew. Aegeon leaning boisterously on backs of mighty whales, and Doris with her daughters all, of which some cut the whales with splayed arms, some sat on rocks and dried their goodly hair, and some did ride upon the backs of fishes here and there. Not one in all points fully like another could ye see, nor very far unlike, but such as sisters ought to be. The earth had towns, men, beasts, and woods with sundry trees and rods, and running rivers with their nymphs and other country gods. Directly over all these same the plat of heaven was pight upon the two door leaves, the signs of all the zodiac bright, indifferently 6 on the left and 6 on the right. When Climene's son had climbed up at length with weary pace, and set his foot within his doubted father's dwelling place, immediately he pressed forth to put himself in sight, and stood aloof. For near at hand he could not bide the light. In purple robe and royal throne of emeralds fresh and green did Phoebus sit, and on each hand stood waiting well beseen, days, months, years, ages, seasons, times, and eke the equal hours. There stood the springtime with a crown of fresh and fragrant flowers. There waited summer, naked stark all save a wheaten hat, and autumn smeared with treading grapes late at the pressing vat. And lastly, quaking for the cold, stood winter all forlorn, with rugged head as white as dove, and garments all too torn, foreladen with the icicles that dangled up and down upon his grey and hoary beard, in snowy frozen crown. The sun thus sitting in the midst did cast his piercing eye, with which full lightly when he list he all things doth espy, upon his child that stood aloof, aghast and trembling sore at sight of such unwonted things, and thus bespake him Thor: O noble imp! O Phaeton, which art not such, I see, of whom thy father should have cause ashamed for to be, why hast thou travelled to my court? What is thy will with me? Then answered he: Of all the world, O only perfect light, O Father Phoebus, if I may usurp that name of right, and that my mother, for to save herself from worldly shame, hide not her fault with false pretense in colour of thy name, some sign apparent grant whereby I may be known thy son, and let me hang no more in doubt. He had no sooner done, but that his father, putting off the bright and fiery beams that glistered round about his head like clear and golden streams, commanded him to draw him near, and him embracing said, To take me for thy rightful sire thou need not be afraid. Thy mother Clymen of a truth from falsehood standeth free. And for to put thee out of doubt, ask what thou wilt of me, and I will give thee thy desire, the lake whereby of old we gods do swear, the which mine eyes did never yet behold, bear witness with thee of my grant. He scarce this tale had told, but that the foolish Phaeton straight for a day did crave the guiding of his winged steeds and chariot for to have. Then did his father by and by forethink him of his oath, and shaking 20 times his head, as one that was full wroth, bespake him thus: Thy words have made me rashly to consent to that which shortly both of us, I fear me, shall repent. Oh, that I might retract my grant! My son, I do protest I would deny thee nothing else save this thy fond request. I may dissuade, there lies herein more peril than thou ween. The things the which thou doest desire of great importance been, more than thy weakness well can wield, a charge as well appears, of greater weight than may agree with these thy tender years. Thy state is mortal, weak and frail. The thing thou doest desire is such, whereto no mortal man is able to aspire. Yea, foolish boy, thou doest desire, and all for want of wit, a greater charge than any god could ever have as yet. For were there any of them all so overseen and blind to take upon him this my charge, full quickly should he find that none but I could sit upon the fiery axle-tree. No, not even he that rules this waste and endless space we see, not he that darts with dreadful hand the thunder from the sky, shall drive this chair. And yet what thing in all the world, perdie, is able to compare with Jove? Now first the morning way lies steep upright, so that the steeds in coolest of the day, in being fresh, have much ado to climb against the hill. Amidst the heaven the ghastly height augmenteth terror still. My heart doth wax as cold as ice, full many a time and oft, for fear to see the sea and land from that same place aloft. The evening way doth fall plump down, requiring strength to guide, that Tethys, who doth harbour me within her surges wide, doth stand in fear, lest from the heaven I headlong down should slide. Besides all this, the heaven ice swims and wheels about full swift, and with his rolling drives the stars their proper course to shift. Yet do I keep my native course against this brunt so stout, not giving place as others do, but boldly bearing out the force and swiftness of that heaven that whirleth so about. Admit thou had my winged steeds and chariot in thine hand. What couldst thou do? Dost think thyself well able to withstand the swiftness of the whirled poles? But that their brunt and sway, yea, do the best and worst thou can, shall bear thee quite away. Perchance thou dost imagine there some towns of gods to find, with groves and temples riched with gifts as is among mankind. Thou art deceived utterly. Thou shalt not find it so. By blind byways and ugly shapes of monsters must thou go. And though thou knew the way so well as that thou could not stray, between the dreadful bulls' sharp horns yet must thou make thy way. Against the cruel bow the which the Ammonian archer draws, against the ramping lion, armed with greedy teeth and paws, against the scorpion stretching far his fell and venomed claws, and eke the crab, that casteth forth his crooked clees awry, not in such sort as the other doth, and yet as dreadfully. Again, thou neither hast the power nor yet the skill, I know, my lusty coursers for to guide, that from their nostrils throw and from their mouths the fiery breath that breedeth in their breast. For scarcely will they suffer me, who knows their nature best, when that their cruel courages begin to catch a heat, that hardly should I deal with them, but that I know the feat. But lest my gift should to thy grief and utter peril tend, my son, beware, and, while thou mayest, thy fond request amend. Because thou would be known to be my child, thou seemest to crave a certain sign. What surer sign, I pray thee, canst thou have, than this my fear so fatherly, the which I have of thee, which proveth me most certainly thy father for to be? Behold and mark my countenance. Oh, would to God thy sight could pierce within my woeful breast, to see the heavy plight and heaps of cares within my heart. Look through the world so round of all the wealth and goods therein. If aught there may be found in heaven or earth or in the sea, ask what thou likest best, and sure it shall not be denied. This only one request that thou hast made, I heartily beseech thee to relent, which for to term the thing aright is even a punishment, and not an honour as thou thinkest. My Phaeton, thou dost crave instead of honour, even a scourge and punishment for to have. Thou fondling, thou, what dost thou mean with fawning arms about my neck thus flatteringly to hang? Thou needest not to doubt. I have already sworn by Styx. Ask what thou wilt of me, and thou shalt have. Yet let thy next wish somewhat wiser be. Thus ended his advertisement, and yet the wilful lad withstood his counsel, urging still the promise that he had, desiring for to have the chair as if he had been mad. His father, having made delay as long as he could shift, did lead him where his chariot stood, which was of Vulcan's gift. The axle tree was massy gold, the buck was massy gold, the utmost fellies of the wheels, and where the tree was rolled. The spokes were all of silver bright, the chrysolites and gems that stood upon the collars, trace, and hounces in their hems, did cast a sheer and glimmering light, as Phoebus shone thereon. Now while the lusty Phaeton stood gazing hereupon, and wondered at the workmanship of everything, behold, the early morning in the east began me to unfold her purple gates, and showed her house bedecked with roses red. The twinkling stars withdrew, which by the morning star are led, who, as the captain of that host that hath no peer nor match, doeth leave his standing last of all within that heavenly watch. Now when his father saw the world thus glister red and trim, and that his waning sister's horns began to waxen dim, he had the feather-footed Hours go harness in his horse, the goddesses with might and main themselves thereto enforce. His fiery foaming steeds, full fed with juice of ambrosie, they take from manger trimly dight, into their heads do tie strong reined bits, into the chariot do them well appoint. Then Phoebus did with heavenly salve his Phaeton's head anoint, that scorching fire could nothing hurt. Which done, upon his hair he put the fresh and golden rays himself was wont to wear. And then as one whose heart misgave the sorrows drawing fast, with sorry sighs he thus bespake his wretchless son at last. And if thou canst, at least yet this thy father's lore obey. Son, spare the whip, and rein them hard, they run so swift away, as that thou shalt have much ado their fleeing course to stay. Directly through the zones all five, beware thou do not ride. A broad byway, cut out askew, that bendeth on the side, contained within the bonds of three, the midmost zones doth lie, which from the grisly northern bear and southern pole doth fly. Keep on this way. My chariot rakes thou plainly shalt espy, and to the intent that heaven and earth may well the heat endure, drive neither over high nor yet too low. For be thou sure, and if thou mount above thy bounds, the stars thou burnest clean, again beneath thou burn'st the earth. Most safety is the mean. And least perchance thou overmuch the right-hand way should take, and so misfortune should thee drive upon the writhen snake. Or else by taking overmuch upon the lefter hand, unto the altar thou be driven that doth against it stand. Indifferently between them both I wish thee for to ride. The rest I put to fortune's will, who be thy friendly guide, and better for thee than thyself as in this case provide. Whiles that I prattle here with thee, behold the Dankish night beyond all Spain, her utmost bound is passed out of sight. We may no longer tarriance make. My wonted light is called. The morning with her countenance clear the darkness hath appalled. Take rein in hand, or if thy mind by counsel altered be, refuse to meddle with my wane. And while thou yet art free, and dost at ease within my house and safeguard well remain, of this thy unadvised wish not feeling yet the pain, let me alone with giving still the world his wonted light, and thou thereof as heretofore enjoy the harmless sight. Thus much in vain, for Phaeton, both young in years and wit, into the chariot lightly leapt, and vancing him in it was not a little proud that he the bridle gotten had. He thanked his father, whom it grieved to see his child so mad. While Phoebus and his reckless son were enter-talking this, Eus, Aethon, Phlegon, and the fiery Pyroes, the restless horses of the sun, began to neigh so high with flaming breath that all the heaven might hear them perfectly. And with their hoofs they mainly beat upon the latticed grate, the which when Tethys, knowing not of this her cousin's fate, had put aside, and given the steeds the free and open scope of all the compass of the sky within the heavenly cope, they girded forth, and cutting through the clouds that let their race, with splayed wings they overflew the eastern wind apace. The burden was so light as that the jennets felt it not. The wonted weight was from the wain, the which they well did wot. For like as ships amidst the seas that scant of ballast have, do reel and totter with the wind, and yield to every wave, even so the wain, for want of weight it erst was wont to bear, did hoist aloft and scale and reel, as though it empty were. Which when the cartware did perceive, they left the beaten way, and taking bridle in the teeth began to run astray. The rider was so sore aghast, he knew no use of rein, nor yet his way, and though he had, yet had it been in vain, because he wanted power to rule the horses and the wain. Then first did sweat cold Charles his wain through force of Phoebus raise, and in the sea forbidden him to dive in vain essays. The serpent at the frozen pole, both cold and slow by kind, through heat waxed wroth, and stirred about a cooler place to find. And thou, Boetes, though thou be but slow of footmanship, yet wert thou fain, as fame reports, about thy wain to skip. Now when unhappy Phaeton from top of all the sky beheld the earth that underneath a great way off did lie, he waxed pale for sudden fear, his joints and sinews quook. The greatness of the glistering light his eyesight from him took. Now wished he that he never had his father's horses see. It irked him that he thus had sought to learn his pedigree. It grieved him that he had prevailed in gaining his request. To have been counted Merop's son, he thought it now the best. Thus thinking was he headlong driven, as when a ship is borne by blustering winds, her sail-clothes rent, her stern in pieces torn, and tackling brust, the which the pilot, trusting all to prayer, abandons wholly to the sea and fortune of the air. What should he do? Much of the heaven he past had behind, and more he saw before, both which he measured in his mind, eft looking forward to the west, which to approach as then might not betide, and to the east, eft looking back again. He wist not what was best to do, his wits were ravished so, for neither could he hold the reins, nor yet durst let them go, and of his horses' names was none that he remembered though. Strange uncouth monsters did he see dispersed here and there, and dreadful shapes of ugly beasts that in the welkin were. There is a certain place in which the hideous scorpion throws his arms and compass far abroad, much like a couple of bows, with writhen tail and clasping clees, whose poison limbs do stretch on every side, that of two signs they full the room do retch. Whom when the lad beheld, all moist with black and loathly sweat, with sharp and needle-pointed sting as though he seemed to threat, he was so sore astraught for fear, he let the bridle slack, which when the horses felt lie loose upon their sweating back, at rovers straight throughout the air by ways unknown they ran, whereas they never came before, since that the world began. For look what way their lawless rage by chance and fortune drew, without controlment or restraint, that way they freely flew. Among the stars that fixed are within the firmament, they snatched the chariot here and there. One while they coursing went upon the top of all the sky. Anon again full round they troll me down to lower ways and nearer to the ground, so that the moon was in amaze to see her brother's wain run under hers. The singed clouds began to smoke amain. Each ground the higher that it was, and nearer to the sky, the sooner was it set on fire, and made therewith so dry that everywhere it gan to chink. The meads and pastures green did sear away, and with the leaves the trees were burned clean. The parched corn did yield wherewith to work his own decay. Tush, these are trifles. Mighty towns did perish that same day, whose countries with their folk were burnt, and forests full of wood were turned to ashes with the rocks and mountains where they stood. Then Athe, Cilician, Tar and Tmol and Etta flamed high, and Ide, erst full of flowing springs, was then made utter dry. The learned virgins daily haunt, the sacred Helicon, and Thracian Hemus, not as yet surnamed Oegrion, did smoke both twain, and Aetna, hot of nature I before, increased by force of Phoebus' flame, now raged 10 times more. The forked Parnassus, Eryx, Synth, and Othrys then did swelt, and all the snow of Rhodope did at that present melt. The like outrage Mount Dindymus, and Mymi, and Mycale felt, Cithaeron born to sacred use with Os, and Pindus high, and Olymp greater than them both did burn excessively. The passing cold that Scythia defended, not the same, but that the barren Caucasus was partner of this flame, and so were eke the airy Alps and Apennine beside, for all the clouds continually their snowy tops do hide. Then wheresoever Phaeton did chance to cast his view, the world was all on flaming fire. The breath the which he drew came smoking from his scalding mouth as from a seething pot. His chariot also under him began to wax red hot. He could no longer dure the sparks and cinder flying out. Again the calm and smouldering smoke did wrap him round about. The pitchy darkness of the which so wholly had him hent, as that he wist not where he was, nor yet which way he went. The winged horses forcibly did draw him where they would. The Ethiopians at that time, as men for truth uphold, the blood by force of that same heat drawn to the outer part, and there adust from that time forth, became so black and swart. The moisture was so dried up in Libby land that time, that altogether dry and scorched continueth yet that clime. The nymphs, with hair about their ears, bewailed their springs and lakes. Boeotia for her Dirce's loss great lamentation makes. For Amymone, Argos wept, and Corinth for the spring Pyrene, at whose sacred stream the Muses used to sing. The rivers further from the place were not in better case, for Tanais in his deepest stream did boil and steam apace. Old Penu and Caicus of the country Teuthrani, and swift Ismenos in their banks by like misfortune fry. Then burned the Sophian Erymanth, and, which should burn again, the Trojan Xanthus and Lycormus with his yellow vein. Meander playing in his banks aye winding to and fro, Mygdonian Melas with his waves as black as any sloe. Eurotas running by the foot of Tanare boiled though. Then sawed Euphrates cutting through the middies of Babylon. Then sawed Orontes and the Scythian swift Thermodon. Then Ganges, Colchian Phasis, and the noble Istri, Alpheus, and Sperchius banks, with flaming fire did glister. The gold that Tagus stream did bear, did in the channel melt. Amid Caster of this fire the raging heat was felt among the choirs of singing swans, that with their pleasant lay along the banks of Lydian brakes, from place to place did stray. And Nile, for fear, did run away into the furthest clime of all the world, and hid his head, which to this present time is yet unfound. His mouths all seven clean void of water been, like seven great valleys, where, save dust, could nothing else be seen. By like misfortune Hebrus dried, and Strymon, both of Thrace. The western rivers, Rhine and Rhone and Po, were in like case. And Tiber, unto whom the gods a faithful promise gave, of all the world the monarchy and sovereign state to have. The ground did cranny everywhere, and light did pierce to hell, and made afraid the king and queen that in that realm do dwell. The sea did shrink, and whereas waves did late before remain, became a champion field of dust, and even a sandy plain. The hills erst hid far under waves like islands did appear, so that the scattered Cyclades for the time augmented were. The fishes drew them to the deeps, the dolphins durst not play above the water as before. The seals and porpoise lay with bellies upward on the waves, stark dead. And fame doth go that Nereus, with his wife and daughters, all were fain as though to dive within the scalding waves. Thrice Neptune did advance his arms above the scalding sea with sturdy countenance, and thrice for hotness of the air was fain himself to hide. But yet the earth, the nurse of things, enclosed on every side, between the waters of the sea and springs that now had hidden themselves within their mother's womb, for all the pain abidden, up to the neck put forth her head, and casting up her hand between her forehead and the sun, as panting she did stand with dreadful quaking. All that was she fearfully did shake, and shrinking somewhat lower down, with sacred voice thus spake. O King of gods, and if this be thy will and my desert, why dost thou stay with deadly dint thy thunder down to dart? And if that needs I perish must through force of fiery flame, let thy celestial fire, O God, I pray thee, do the same. A comfort shall it be to have thee author of my death. I scarce have power to speak these words. The smoke had stopped her breath. Behold my singed hair. Behold my dim and bleared eye. See how about my scorched face the scalding embers fly. Is this the guerdon wherewithal ye quite my fruitfulness? Is this the honor that ye gave me for my plenteousness, and duty done with true intent? For suffering of the plough to draw deep wounds upon my back, and rakes to rend me through? For that I over all the year continually am wrought? For giving fodder to the beasts and cattle all for naught? For yielding corn and other food wherewith to keep mankind? And that to honor you withal sweet frankincense I find. But put the case that my desert destruction duly crave. What hath thy brother? What the seas deserved for to have? Why do the seas, his lauded part, thus ebb and fall so low, withdrawing from thy sky to which it ought most near to grow? But if thou neither dost regard thy brother, neither me, at least have mercy on thy heaven. Look round about and see how both the poles begin to smoke, which if the fire appall to utter ruin, be thou sure, thy palace needs must fall. Behold how Atlas gins to faint, his shoulders though full strong, unneth are able to uphold the sparkling extree long. If sea and land do go to wreck, and heaven itself do burn, to old confused chaos then of force we must return. Put to thy helping hand therefore to save the little left, if aught remain before that all be quite and clean bereft. When ended was this piteous plaint, the earth did hold her peace. She could no longer dure the heat, but was compelled to cease. Into her bosom by and by she shrunk her singed head, more nearer to the Stygian caves and ghosts of persons dead. The sire of heaven protesting all the gods, and him also that lent the chariot to his child, that all of force must go to havoc if he helped not, went to the highest part and top of all the heaven, from whence his custom was to dart his thunder and his lightning down. But neither did remain a cloud wherewith to shade the earth, nor yet a shower of rain. Then with a dreadful thunderclap up to his ear he bent his fist, and at the wagoner a flash of lightning sent, which strake his body from the life, and threw it over wheel, and so with fire he quenched fire. The steeds did also reel upon their knees, and starting up sprang violently, one here and there another, that they brast in pieces all their gear. They threw the collars from their necks, and breaking quite asunder, the trace and harness fling away. Here lay the bridles, yonder the extree plucked from the naves, and in another place the shivered spokes of broken wheels. And so at every pace the pieces of the chariot torn lay strowed here and there. But Phaeton, fire yet blazing still among his yellow hair, shot headlong down, and glid along the region of the air, like to a star in winter nights, the weather clear and fair, which though it do not fall indeed, yet falleth to our sight, whom almost in another world and from his country quite, the river Padus did receive, and quenched his burning head. The water nymphs of Italy did take his carcass dead, and buried it yet smoking still, with Jove's three-forked flame. And rate this epitaph in the stone that lay upon the same. Here lies the lusty Phaeton, which took in hand to guide his father's chariot, from the which, although he chanced to slide, yet that he gave a proud attempt it cannot be denied. With ruthful cheer and heavy heart, his father made great moan, and would not show himself abroad, but mourned at home, alone. And if it be to be believed, as bruited is by fame, a day did pass without the sun. The brightness of the flame gave light, and so unto some kind of use that mischief came. But Climon having spoke, as much as mothers usually are wanted in such wretched case, discomfortably, and half beside herself for woe, with torn and scratched breast, searched through the universal world, from east to furthest west, first seeking for her son's dead corse, and after for his bones. She found them by a foreign stream, and tumbled under stones. There fell she grovelling on his grave, and reading there his name, shed tears thereon, and laid her breast all bare upon the same. The daughters also of the sun, no less than did their mother, bewailed in vain with floods of tears the fortune of their brother, and beating piteously their breasts, incessantly did call the buried Phaeton day and night, who heard them not at all, about whose tomb they prostrate lay. 4 times the moon had filled the circle of her joined horns, and yet the sisters held their custom of lamenting still, for now continual use had made it custom. Of the which the eldest, Phaeton, about to kneel upon the ground, complained her feet were numb. To whom as fair Lampede was rising for to come, her feet were held with sudden roots. The third, about to tear her ruffled locks, filled both her hands with leaves instead of hair. One wept to see her legs made wood, another did repine to see her arms become long boughs. And shortly to define, while thus they wondered at themselves, a tender bark began to grow about their thighs and loins, which shortly overran their bellies, breasts, and shoulders eke, and hands successively, that nothing, save their mouths, remained, I calling piteously upon the woeful mother's help. What could the mother do, but run now here, now there, as force of nature drew her to, and deal her kisses while she might? She was not so content, but tear their tender branches down, and from the slivers went red drops of blood as from a wound. The daughter that was rent cried, Spare us, mother, spare, I pray, for in the shape of tree the bodies and the flesh of us your daughters wounded be. And now farewell. That word once said, the bark grew over all. Now from these trees flow gummy tears that amber men do call, which, hardened with the heat of sun as from the boughs they fall, the trickling river doth receive, and sends as things of price to deck the dainty dames of Rome, and make them fine and nice. Now present at this monstrous hap was Cygnus, Sthenel's son, who, being by the mother's side akin to Phaeton, was in condition more akin. He leaving up his charge, for in the land of Liguri his kingdom stretched large, went mourning all along the banks and pleasant stream of Po, among the trees increased by the sisters late ago. Anon his voice became more small and shrill than for a man. Grey feathers muffled in his face, his neck in length began far from his shoulders for to stretch. And furthermore there goes a fine red string across the joints and knitting of his toes. With feathers closed are his sides, and on his mouth there grew a broad, blunt bill. And finally was Cygnus made a new and uncouth fowl that hight a swan, who neither to the wind, the air, nor Jove betakes himself, as one that bare in mind the wrongful fire sent late against his cousin Phaeton. In lakes and rivers is his joy, the fire he aye doth shun, and chooseth him the contrary continually to one. Forlorn and altogether void of that same body's sheen was Phaeton's father in that while which erst had in him been, like as he looketh in the eclipse. He hates the irksome light, he hates himself, he hates the day, and sets his whole delight in making sorrow for his son, and in his grief doth storm and chafe, denying to the world his duty to perform. My lot, quoth he, hath had enough of this unquiet state from first beginning of the world. It irks me, though too late, of restless toils and thankless pains. Let whoso will for me go drive the chariot in the which the light should carried be. If none dare take the charge in hand, and all the gods persist as insufficient, he himself go drive it if he list, that at the least, by venturing our bridles for to guide, his lightning making childless sires, he once may lay aside. By that time that he hath assayed the unappalled force, that doth remain and rest within my fiery-footed horse, I trow he shall by tried proof be able for to tell, how that he did not merit death that could not rule them well. The gods stood all about the sun, thus storming in his rage, beseeching him in humble wise his sorrow to assuage. And that he would not on the world continual darkness bring, Jove eke excused him of the fire the which he chanced to sling, and with entreatance mingled threats as did become a king. Then Phoebus gathered up his steeds, that yet for fear did run like flated fiends, and in his mood without respect began to beat his whipstock on their pates, and lash them on the sides. It was no need to bid him chaff, for ever as he rides he still upbraids them with his son, and lays them on the hides.